The night does not end where the horizon breaks. For some it begins inside the walls they trust the most. There is a silence that seeps into wood, brick and bone. A silence too heavy to be natural. A silence that presses against the ears until even the smallest sound feels like a betrayal. On an unremarkable stretch of countryside, where houses sat miles apart and where trees bent under the weight of age, one house became known for what was heard inside it. Or rather, for what was never heard again. It is easy to dismiss such stories as exaggeration, tales stretched to frighten children or amuse the curious. Yet the records remain. Police reports, half-forgotten diary entries, whispers kept alive by generations too afraid to say them aloud, but too burdened to let them die in silence. They all speak of the same thing, a family that vanished without reason, without trace, without noise. No broken locks, no footprints leading away, no neighbors who noticed anything unusual. One moment they existed. The next, the house was empty, the dinner table set as if waiting for mouths that would never return. A chair had been overturned, though there were no signs of struggle. A kettle sat cooling on the stove as though someone had only just removed it from the fire. Beds upstairs remained made, but in one room a child's blanket lay crumpled on the floor, almost as though a small hand had reached for it in the dark, only to never pull it close again. Every detail was painfully ordinary. And perhaps that was the most terrifying part. Ordinary things frozen at the exact second life slipped out of the house, as though time itself recoiled and left everything to decay quietly in its absence. Visitors who stepped inside the house after the disappearance described the same sensation. The air felt too still, too heavy, as if the walls had absorbed a secret they would never allow to escape. Some swore they heard a low hum, almost beneath the level of hearing, like a vibration inside the skull rather than in the ears. Others claimed the silence was worse than any sound, that it was thick, suffocating, as though something was waiting in that silence, listening, deciding whether or not to make itself known. The most unsettling account came from an officer who entered the house late at night to continue the search. He admitted in his report that the moment he crossed the threshold, his hands shook uncontrollably, though the air was neither cold nor damp. He described the sensation of being watched, not from one direction but from every corner at once. His words were simple and without flourish, the language of a man trained to be exact. I felt the house knew I was there. I felt it wanted me to leave. He did not stay long. There was no explanation for what happened. Investigators suggested that the family had fled, though no valuables were missing, no clothes were taken, no preparations made for departure. Others whispered of a crime, but no evidence was ever found. No blood, no signs of forced entry, no neighbors who saw strangers approach. The community around the house refused to speak of it for years, and when they finally did, their words carried more weight than any official statement. They did not say the family had left. They did not say they were taken. They only said this: the house kept them. The story, like all stories, began to change over time. Some claimed they saw lights flickering in the windows years after, though the electricity had long since been cut. Others swore they heard children's laughter echoing faintly from the upstairs rooms, laughter that ended not in joy but in something sharp, as though caught mid-breath. The land was eventually abandoned and the house allowed to rot. Its windows shattered one by one, its walls sagged inward and ivy climbed to choke the roof. Yet still, travelers who came too close swore they felt eyes on them. Not from the forest, not from the empty road, but from the hollowed shell of the house itself. This was not the first time people had gone missing without explanation. History is heavy with such disappearances. Ships lost at sea with crews intact and meals untouched, villages discovered without inhabitants, food still simmering on stoves, people swallowed whole by silence as though erased by something unseen but deliberate. Perhaps what makes these stories so difficult to confront is not simply the absence of answers, but the suggestion that disappearance is not always an accident, that sometimes it is the result of something waiting, something patient, something that takes not when you are prepared to fight, but when you are unaware that you are in danger at all. The questions remain. Who or what decides the moment when a life will be removed? Why does it leave behind ordinary things? The folded shirts, the half-written letters, the toys left mid-play, as though mocking the people who search for meaning in what remains. If the family had suffered, there were no signs. If they had fought, no one had heard. It was as if the world itself had turned away, allowing them to slip out quietly into something no one could see. And this is the thought that lingers, long after the story is told. If a house can keep them, what prevents it from keeping others? If silence can swallow without sound, without trace, what keeps it from choosing again? So when you walk into your home tonight, when you hear the walls settle and the floorboards groan, ask yourself, what if it is not the house moving, but the house listening? What if it has already chosen the moment when you will not return? The land around the house was older than the town itself. Long before maps were drawn and borders were marked, the soil had swallowed countless seasons of rain and rot, carrying beneath it stories that no one had written down. By the late 19th century, settlers had begun carving lives out of the wilderness, building small communities where the earth seemed forgiving and the rivers ran steady. They built homes with their own hands, homes meant to endure generations. But every foundation has a cost, and this one demanded silence. The house stood at the edge of farmland, a structure neither grand nor modest, just a two-story frame of weathered timber painted white. At a distance, it looked like any other farmhouse, but up close, details began to unsettle. The windows seemed too narrow, the angles of the roof just slightly uneven, as if the house leaned toward itself. The wood had darkened in unnatural streaks, not from rain, but from something beneath the surface, a seepage that stained upward instead of down. It was not a ruin, but it never looked new, even when freshly built. Locals often remarked that the house gave the impression of remembering something. The family who lived there had arrived quietly, without fanfare. They were not remarkable people. The father worked the land, the mother tended the home, and the children filled the air with the kind of laughter that momentarily disguises the truth that childhood is fleeting. Neighbors described them as polite, though distant, never eager to share more than was required. They attended gatherings but left early. They bought supplies but never lingered to chat. No one disliked them, but no one ever truly knew them either. Perhaps that was why when they disappeared, no one felt confident enough to say who they had been in the first place. The town that surrounded them was small, the kind of place where news traveled faster than truth. Everyone knew when a birth happened, when a storm broke fences, when a neighbor fell ill. But everyone also knew what not to speak of. The land itself had a way of teaching silence. It was a place where families buried their dead in unmarked graves, where stories of strange sounds in the woods were quietly passed to children as warnings disguised as lullabies. Men who worked the fields swore that at night they heard voices just beyond the tree line, though when they turned to look, there was no one there. Women who washed clothes in the river sometimes claimed to see shapes in the water, shadows drifting against the current instead of with it. Still, people endured. Silence became survival. They built their lives around what they could explain and ignored what they could not. Yet no matter how much they turned away, the sense of being watched never truly left. It was as though the land itself resented them, resented their wooden fences and their plows that tore open its soil. Perhaps that was why the family had chosen the house on the edge, far enough from the others that no one could hear what might happen behind closed doors. Children in the town whispered about the house, though they had no reason to. They said the windows looked like eyes always staring back. They dared each other to stand at the gate until the sun dipped low, and then they would run, breathless and pale, swearing they had heard something move inside even when no one was supposed to be home. Adults dismissed these tales, but they never encouraged their children to play near the property. Some boundaries did not need fences. There was a story, one often dismissed as superstition, that long before the family built their home, the land had been avoided by those who came before. Native tribes had left the clearing untouched, passing around it as though it were already claimed. Some said the ground was too soft, too willing to swallow footsteps. Others believed that the wind did not pass over it naturally but circled, like a hand closing around a fragile thing. Whether these stories were true or only imagined to give shape to fear, they were enough to keep people away. Until the family arrived, until the house was built. The seasons around the house never felt right. Summers were too still, the air too thick. Winters dragged longer than they should, as if the cold had no desire to leave. Neighbors remarked that the trees along the property line bloomed late, their branches bending as though burdened by something heavier than fruit or snow. Birds perched along the fences but rarely entered the yard. Dogs refused to cross the gate. Cattle led too close would pull against their ropes, eyes wide, hooves digging into the soil as if warning their handlers to turn back. And yet, for years, nothing happened, or at least nothing anyone was willing to speak of. The family lived their lives behind the pale curtains of the upstairs windows, the faint glow of lamplight their only signal to the world outside. They were neither prosperous nor poor, neither beloved nor despised. They were simply there, and perhaps that was what made their disappearance so jarring. No quarrels preceded it. No debts weighed them down. No scandals forced them into silence. Their life had been unremarkable, and then suddenly it was gone. But even before the night they vanished, the land carried signs. Neighbors recalled odd silences when passing by the house, as though the sound of insects and birds collapsed the moment one drew near. They remembered a smell, faint but unmistakable, like iron warmed under the sun. They remembered the way lamplight flickered in the windows too fast, as though it was not light at all but movement. They said they had seen the children less often, their voices no longer drifting across the fields at dusk. And they remembered the mother's eyes when she came into town for supplies. Her gaze lingered on nothing, her words too quick, her smile pulled too tight. She did not look afraid exactly, but she looked as though she carried the knowledge of something that had already begun and could not be stopped. No one thought to ask. No one wanted to. In a place where silence was safety, people preferred not to know. But the land keeps its stories even when mouths refuse to tell them. And on that night when the house held its silence tighter than ever before, the town finally learned what it meant to ignore what was always waiting. It began quietly, in ways so small that no one thought to connect them, the kind of details that seemed harmless at first, dismissed as coincidence or imagination. But if one were to look back, if one were to lay the pieces side by side, a picture begins to form, a picture of something closing in long before the family was taken. The first sign came in whispers that did not belong to the house. The father told a neighbor in passing, without humor, that sometimes he woke at night believing someone had spoken his name. He would sit up, straining his ears against the silence, only to find the room empty and the rest of the household undisturbed. He convinced himself it was the echo of dreams, some remnant of sleep clinging too long to his waking mind. But he admitted in one rare conversation that the voice was not his wife's, nor a child's, nor any sound he could place. It was low, even steady, as if spoken not into his ear but directly into the marrow of his bones. Soon after, the children began to wake unsettled. They cried without knowing why, pointing toward corners of their bedroom where nothing stood. They complained of shapes in the dark, not the natural shifting of shadows, but something deliberate, as though the dark itself leaned forward to study them. The mother, weary and protective, tried to soothe them with lullabies, yet she too began to notice the peculiar silence in the house at night. It was not the peace of sleep but the absence of life, the suspension of sound as though the air itself paused and held its breath. She told herself she was imagining it. Mothers often do until imagination refuses to fade. Neighbors passing the property in the late evening began to notice something strange about the lights. They flickered in the upstairs windows long after the family should have been asleep. Sometimes they glowed brighter than a lantern should, and sometimes they blinked, as though extinguished and relit in perfect rhythm. One traveler swore he saw two lights moving slowly from one end of the house to the other, side by side, as if carried by unseen hands. But when he returned his gaze for a second look, the windows were dark, empty, reflecting only the pale smear of moonlight. Animals grew restless near the property. Horses balked when led past the gate, rolling their eyes and pulling at their reins until their handlers were forced to take longer routes. Dogs bristled and growled at the empty air, refusing to move forward. Even the livestock within the family's own barn became unsettled. The cattle kicked at the walls, their breathing frantic, their eyes wide and bloodshot, as though sensing something their owners could not. The family dismissed it as sickness or weather, but no remedy calmed the animals for long. The father tried to work the land as he always had, but neighbors remembered his appearance changing. His face grew hollow, his eyes ringed with shadows, his movements slow, deliberate, as though every gesture required too much effort. He was not a man who spoke of fear, yet in his silence there was something heavier than words. The mother, once polite though reserved, stopped coming into town altogether. The children, once seen darting through fields with laughter trailing behind them, were no longer heard. Then came the smell. Those who passed by the property described it as faint but undeniable, iron, damp soil, and something sweet that clung to the back of the throat. It drifted across the fields, carried on breezes that should not have reached so far. At night, the odor seemed to thicken, strong enough that neighbors swore they could taste it even in their own homes. When asked later, none could describe it fully. They only agreed it was wrong, that it made them uneasy, that it lingered long after it should have faded. One evening, a neighbor's son claimed he saw something at the edge of the family's yard. He said it looked like a figure tall and unmoving, standing by the fence line. When pressed, he insisted it was not a person, not exactly. It seemed too still, too sharp around the edges, as if its outline were cut into the world rather than belonging to it. His father scolded him for frightening his siblings with tales, but years later, when the boy was grown, he never retracted his words. He said the figure turned its head slowly toward him, though it had no face, and for the first time in his life he felt truly watched. Days before the family vanished, the mother was seen for the last time in town. Witnesses recalled her hands trembling as she paid for flour and lamp oil. She spoke little, and when she did, her voice wavered. One shopkeeper remembered her asking, almost in a whisper, if he had ever felt as though something followed him home. He laughed, thinking it a jest, but she did not smile. Her eyes, he said, were already somewhere else, as though she had left her body behind long before her feet carried her out the door. On the night itself, nothing was heard. No screams, no footsteps, no pleas for help. The neighbors awoke to the same silence they had grown used to, the kind that seemed to press down from the trees. Yet in the morning, when a visitor came to call, the house did not answer. The front door was unlocked. The table was set. The kettle was cooling. The beds upstairs were untouched. And the family, every member of it, was gone. The clock in the hallway had stopped at some hour in the night, though no one could agree on when. Its pendulum hung still as though frozen mid-swing, and in the nursery, the child's blanket lay in a crumpled heap on the floor. To this day, some say it looked as though a hand had been reaching for it. Others believe it was not dropped but taken. From that moment forward, nothing about the house was ordinary again. The silence was no longer an absence. It was presence, a weight, a reminder, and though the family's names were written into ledgers and carved into stone, their lives ended not with death but with disappearance, the kind of disappearance that does not close a story but forces it to remain open, unhealed, bleeding into the years that follow. The search of the house was not immediate. In a town where silence was often the safest response, it took hours before someone stepped past the gate and crossed the threshold. When they did, what they found unsettled them, not because of what was there, but because of what was missing. Disappearance leaves no wounds to study, no bodies to bury. It leaves only fragments, ordinary details frozen in place, daring those who find them to interpret meaning where none is clear. The first thing investigators noted was the absence of disturbance. The chairs in the kitchen sat neatly arranged around the table. Plates had been set for a meal, though the food had never been served. A pot of water had boiled down to a thin film at the bottom of the kettle, blackened slightly from heat, but there was no smell of burning, no smoke clinging to the air. On the floor near the table, one chair had been knocked over. It lay flat, as if someone had risen in haste or been pulled back, though the floorboards bore no marks of struggle. There was no broken crockery, no shattered glass, no signs of violence. It was a scene suspended between calm and chaos, suggesting an eruption without completion. Upstairs, the bedrooms offered more confusion. The beds were made, sheets tucked tight as though no one had slept in them. Yet impressions lingered in the mattresses, faint outlines where bodies had recently rested. In one room, the small blanket of the youngest child was found crumpled on the floor, beside the bed, as if it had been dropped in mid-motion. Some believed the child had reached for it in the dark. Others believed it had been pulled away. That single detail, so small, so ordinary, haunted every investigator more than the absence of the family itself. The father's boots remained by the door. His tools were stacked neatly in the shed. The mother's sewing kit sat open, the needle threaded but the cloth unfinished, as if she had been called away only for a moment. The children's toys were scattered in their usual corners. A wooden horse, a ball of twine, small figurines carved from scraps of wood. Nothing was missing. Nothing had been packed. The family had not prepared to leave. Outside, the barn stood open. The livestock were alive but restless, stamping hooves, rolling eyes, their movements frantic. Feed had been left untouched. One officer wrote in his report that the animals refused to quiet even when he spoke to them gently, their panic rising until he retreated. He noted their fear as unreasonable, a word that betrayed more about his own unease than theirs. Neighbors began to provide testimony. Some admitted to hearing strange sounds in the nights leading up to the disappearance, low hums, muffled knocks, the faint scrape of wood against wood as though something moved inside the house when it should have been still. Others confessed they had seen lights flickering in the windows, though they had convinced themselves it was nothing worth mentioning. A few spoke of the smell, metallic and sweet, drifting across the fields without explanation. Yet none of these details could be woven into a clear narrative. The official investigation cataloged everything with care: the positions of chairs, the placement of blankets, the condition of the stove, the silence of the clock, whose pendulum hung still. But the catalog produced no answers. Conflicting accounts deepened the confusion. One officer claimed he felt a pressure in his chest the moment he entered the house, as though the air itself thickened around him. Another insisted there was nothing unusual at all, that the unease came only from suggestion. A visiting official from outside the town dismissed local fears entirely, declaring it the result of voluntary abandonment, though he could not explain why a family would abandon their home without taking clothes, valuables, or provisions. There was also the matter of the footprints. At the edge of the property, where the soil was soft, faint impressions were found leading toward the house. They appeared shallow, spaced too far apart for a child, yet too narrow for a man. They led to the fence line and vanished. No footprints left the house. None trailed away into the fields or toward the road. Investigators marked the discovery, but could not agree whether the prints belonged to boots, bare feet, or something else entirely. The impressions were never photographed. Within days, rain washed them away. The longer the house remained empty, the stronger the unease grew. Those who stood in its rooms swore they felt watched, not from any single corner, but from all of them at once. One man described the sensation of walking through invisible threads, as though he were entangled in something that shifted around him without ever being seen. Another spoke of hearing faint laughter, high-pitched and distant, that ceased the moment he turned his head. These testimonies were never entered into official records, written instead in personal diaries or spoken in hushed voices years later. Theories began to circulate. Some believed the family had been taken, though no evidence of intrusion was found. Others suggested they had fled into the woods in a fit of madness, but no bodies were ever discovered. A few whispered of older stories of the land avoided by those who came before, and wondered aloud if the family had awakened something that preferred silence to intrusion. What made the case most unsettling was not the lack of evidence, but the abundance of it. Fragments that pointed in too many directions at once, fragments that could never be stitched into a whole, a chair overturned but no struggle, beds made but impressions lingering, a blanket crumpled on the floor as though dropped in mid-reach, footprints leading in but not out, animals alive but terrified, lights that flickered when no one should have been awake, sounds without source, smells without cause. Each clue seemed both ordinary and impossible, grounding the mystery in reality while pulling it beyond the reach of explanation. It was as if the disappearance had been carefully staged by something that understood human perception, leaving just enough behind to unsettle but never enough to reveal the truth. And so the house remained, filled not with evidence but with questions, questions that pressed down heavier with each year of silence, questions that did not fade but multiplied, questions that turned absence into something far more terrifying than death. The absence of the family settled over the town like a sickness. At first, people gathered in shock, whispering their disbelief in the corners of shops and at the edges of fields. They spoke in low tones as though raising their voices might invite the same fate into their own homes. But as days stretched into weeks and no explanation emerged, the silence around the event became heavier, more deliberate. The family was gone, and in their place was not closure, not mourning, but a hollow weight that no one wanted to claim. Neighbors began to change. Some avoided the road that passed by the house entirely, preferring to take longer paths across rougher ground rather than glance at its windows. Others, who once mocked superstitions, stopped laughing altogether. They locked their doors earlier, shuttered their windows tighter, and hushed their children when they spoke of strange noises at night. It was not death that frightened them. They had buried their own before. It was the lack of finality, the erasure of life without trace, the way ordinary objects remained while the people who used them did not. It felt like a warning, though no one could agree about what. Grief without bodies is grief without form. Families who lost loved ones in illness or accidents could at least stand at graves, could place flowers and know that something of the person they loved was resting beneath the soil. But here there was nothing. No graves to tend, no remains to hold, no certainty to cling to. The family existed only in memory, and memory is fragile, fading at the edges, reshaping itself with time until the faces of those who vanish grow blurred. People tried to speak of them, but the words caught in their throats. To speak was to acknowledge that absence could happen to anyone. To remain silent was to pretend it never had. Children in the town absorbed the fear long before they understood it. They were warned not to wander too far at dusk, not to play near the tree line, not to approach the abandoned property. Parents explained the rules with urgency, but rarely with reason. Children obeyed because children know when fear is genuine. They whispered among themselves of the vanished family, inventing details that no adult would confirm but none would deny. They claimed to see faces in the broken windows, claimed to hear laughter at night, claimed that if one stood too long by the fence one might feel a hand brush lightly against the back of the neck. These stories should have faded like childish games, yet they persisted, because the house was still there and the silence around it had not been broken. For some, the disappearance left paranoia that never lifted. One woman, whose home stood nearest to the abandoned property, refused to sleep in her bedroom again. She moved her bedding into the kitchen and slept close to the fire, explaining only that the upstairs windows made her feel watched. Another man, who had helped search the house on the day of discovery, stopped speaking altogether. He went about his work in silence, eyes lowered, as if words themselves had become dangerous. Years later, when pressed, he admitted in a trembling voice that he still heard the kettle whistle in his dreams, though he had never been inside the kitchen when it cooled. The town itself seemed to deteriorate under the weight of the event. Families left, claiming they sought better opportunities elsewhere. But those who remained knew the truth. They left because they could not stand the silence pressing down from the abandoned house, could not stand the way shadows lengthened too quickly at dusk, could not stand the memory of neighbors erased without cause. Stores closed, crops went untended, laughter disappeared from the streets. It was not a curse in the sense of spells or rituals. It was the curse of knowledge, the understanding that safety is fragile, that life can be extinguished without reason, without notice, without sound. The few who dared to speak openly about what happened were met with suspicion. To discuss the disappearance was to keep it alive, to give it shape, to feed it. So most chose denial, burying their unease in silence. But denial does not erase fear. It only deepens it. At night, when the lamps were extinguished and the town lay under the weight of its own quiet, people lay awake, listening. They listened to the wind pressing against shutters, to the floorboards creaking under their own weight, to the small sounds of ordinary houses that suddenly felt too deliberate. Every groan of wood, every sigh of settling beams carried the question none of them dared speak aloud. Would they be next? Some grew obsessed. One man, a relative of the vanished family, returned night after night to the property, searching for clues he could never find. He spent hours sitting in the dark, watching the windows, convinced that if he remained long enough, he would see what had taken them. What he saw he never described. But after the 5th night he stopped coming. He moved away weeks later, leaving behind his land, his possessions, even his tools. He told no one why. The emotional toll was not limited to those who had known the family. Outsiders who heard of the story arrived curious, but they rarely stayed. They claimed the air around the house felt different, thicker, as though it carried something unspoken. Some visitors said the silence made them nauseous, pressing into their stomachs until they had to turn away. Others described an ache in their chest, a heaviness that lingered long after they left. They carried that weight with them back to their towns and cities, telling stories that spread the fear further than the borders of the community. What remained, above all, was the absence of answers. Grief needs resolution. Fear needs reason. Without these, the mind begins to turn inward, inventing horrors worse than reality. The people of the town imagined what might have happened in the silence of that house, and the images they created, were often more terrible than anything that could be proven. They saw the family taken one by one, their hands reaching for each other in vain. They saw them swallowed whole, their cries muffled by walls that would not let sound escape. They saw them still inside, unseen, waiting. The psychological wound of that disappearance never healed. Even generations later, descendants of the town carried the story like an infection. They told it in hushed tones to their children, not as legend, but as warning. They avoided the property long after it had rotted into ruin, its roof collapsed, its timbers devoured by moss and mold. For them, the house was not simply abandoned, it was still occupied. Not by the family, not by their ghosts, but by something that had erased them and waited for another chance to do the same. And this is the truth that left its mark deepest of all. Death is bearable because it has shape. Absence is unbearable because it does not. To live near the house was to live with that absence, and it hollowed out the people more effectively than any grave. The official inquiry into the family's disappearance was both meticulous and meaningless. Papers filled with sketches of floor plans, catalogs of objects, interviews with neighbors, and lists of times and dates accumulated until the reports weighed heavier than the truth they sought to uncover. Yet every word seemed to dissolve the moment it was read. There was no blood. There were no bodies. There were no signs of flight. Without the tangible evidence of death or escape, the investigation became a theater of speculation, where every theory carried more doubt than certainty. At first, authorities leaned toward the simplest explanation: voluntary abandonment. Perhaps the family had fled into the night, leaving everything behind. But this theory unraveled almost immediately. Farmers did not leave livestock to starve, nor did mothers abandon their children's blankets, nor did fathers step away from tools sharpened and ready for use. If they had planned to disappear, they would have taken something: clothing, money, food, even small keepsakes. But nothing was missing. Not a single drawer had been emptied, not a single trunk disturbed. Their lives remained in place, stripped only of the people who had lived them. The next theory was violence. Perhaps someone had entered the home and forced the family away, but the doors bore no marks of intrusion. The windows, though fragile, were unbroken. The floorboards did not carry the weight of a struggle. Neighbors reported no sounds of shouting, no cries for help, no evidence of panic. Even the overturned chair seemed less like a desperate thrash than the momentary gesture of someone rising too quickly. If violence had been committed, it was violence without noise, without force, without resistance. And what killer leaves behind? The living evidence of a meal still waiting on the table? Others suggested madness. Perhaps the father had suffered some hidden illness of the mind and led his family into the woods. It would not be the first time despair had driven someone to irrational acts. Yet search parties scoured the surrounding forests and fields for days, leaving markers in the soil, retracing paths again and again. No sign of them was ever found. No prints beyond the faint impressions at the fence line, no clothing snagged on branches, no bodies discovered in shallow graves. The land gave nothing back. When rational explanations failed, whispers began to circulate. The first came from older members of the town, those who remembered the stories told by their own parents, stories of the clearing that was never settled, of the way the wind bent strangely there, of the shadows that lingered too long at dusk. They claimed the family had ignored the warnings of the land itself, and the land had taken its due. Some even whispered of an older name, a word spoken only once before falling into silence again. Not a ghost, not a curse. Something older, something that did not care for names, only for silence. Paranormal theories took root quickly. Some swore that the house was not a house at all, but a doorway, a structure built unknowingly on ground that was thin, fragile, close to whatever lies beneath the surface of ordinary life. The family, they said, had not been taken in the way men take prisoners. They had been pulled through, dissolved into a place that runs parallel to ours, close enough that the impressions in the beds and the cooling kettle remained, but distant enough that no hand could ever reach them again. These stories grew not because people believed them, but because disbelief required more courage than anyone had. Conspiratorial voices suggested something darker in human hands. A government experiment, a group of men in the night, a secret act of removal designed to erase inconvenient witnesses. But this theory faltered for the same reason as the rest. If people had come, they would have left traces. They would have left prints or wagon tracks, or at the very least the smell of gunpowder or fire. There was nothing. Only silence, thicker than any conspiracy could produce. One investigator years later admitted in a private letter that he believed the disappearance was neither human nor supernatural but psychological. He argued that fear itself had consumed the family, that they had lived too long in silence, in isolation, in the weight of an oppressive land that pressed inward until their minds could no longer hold shape. He claimed they had wandered away, together their bodies lost to the wilderness but their possessions left behind like shells. Yet even this explanation failed to soothe him. In the same letter he confessed that when he entered the nursery and saw the blanket on the floor, he felt the distinct impression that someone had been watching him from the corner. He could not look directly at it. He could only sense it, and the sensation remained with him for years. Conflicting testimonies deepened the fracture of truth. Some swore they saw lights in the windows long after the disappearance. Others claimed to hear faint voices drifting across the fields at night, voices too far away to be clear but too deliberate to be mistaken for the wind. A few said the house itself seemed alive, its walls groaning not from age but from something shifting inside. These accounts were dismissed as imagination, yet none of those who reported them ever returned to the property. The final report filed by authorities was thin, offering no conclusion. It listed possibilities but endorsed none. It suggested that further investigation might be warranted, but no further resources were provided. The house was left as it was, abandoned and silent, the case marked unresolved. It joined the archives of unsolved mysteries, reduced to words on aging paper, while the reality of its silence endured in the minds of those who had walked its rooms. But theories did not end with the officials. They grew, spread, multiplied in the years that followed. Every stranger who heard the story added their own explanation. Every descendant who inherited the memory reshaped it with fear. Some believed the family had been swallowed by the earth itself, pulled downward into caverns unseen. Others believed the air in the house had thickened into something alive, suffocating them not with force but with possession. And some, the most disturbed, claimed the family had never truly vanished at all. They were still there, just out of sight, standing silently in the corners, watching, waiting, forever present in the place where their lives had been stolen. In the end, the investigation left only possibilities, each one more disturbing than the last. None explained the absence, none answered the questions. And perhaps that was the most unsettling truth of all, that the event remained open, unresolved, as though the silence itself refused to allow an ending. Time did not erase the story. It buried it under layers of silence, but silence has a way of preserving what people refuse to name. The house, with its sagging beams and shattered windows, eventually collapsed into ruin, but even ruins do not vanish. They linger as bones of memory, reminders of what once stood, reminders of what once disappeared. Grass grew tall around the fallen timbers. Ivy swallowed the walls and storms pulled at what remained until only fragments jutted from the earth. Yet still, travelers who passed too near swore they felt the weight of eyes upon them. It was not the house they feared, nor even the memory of the family. It was the question that remained unanswered. What is more terrifying than death? Perhaps it is disappearance. Death has shape, boundaries, rituals, a body to bury, a name to etch in stone, a final breath to mark an end. But disappearance is infinite. It spreads outward like water soaking into soil, leaving behind nothing to hold, nothing to comfort, nothing to explain. It is an open wound in memory, a constant reminder that what was once here can be taken without sound, without reason, without warning. Generations later, the story is still told. It is whispered to children as caution, though the words change each time. Some say the family was taken by the land, swallowed into caverns beneath the roots of trees. Others claim they stepped into a night so silent that it consumed them, folding their bodies into darkness where light could not follow. Some insist they remain in the house even now, unseen but present, their hands still brushing against curtains, their shadows still pressed into the walls. and others, more fearful still, believe they were not the last. That disappearance is not random but chosen. That silence selects that what happened once can happen again. Perhaps that is why no one rebuilt on the land. Families moved into the surrounding fields, planted crops, built barns, and raised homes. But the clearing remained untouched. Even as farmland grew scarce, even as need pressed hard, no one dared to lay new foundations on the place where the house had stood. It was as if the ground itself carried memory, warning those who came near. And maybe they were right to listen, because the silence there never faded. Insects avoided it. Birds circled wide. Even the wind seemed unwilling to disturb it, moving around rather than across, leaving the clearing unnaturally still. Historians cataloged the event as an unsolved disappearance, nothing more. They filed it among countless other mysteries, the lost villages, the missing ships, the travelers who stepped into forests and never returned. But people who live near such places know better. They know that when an absence is too perfect, too complete, it is not chance. It is design. Something chose and something took. Those who enter the ruins today, explorers, researchers, the curious who seek thrill, often speak afterward of unease. They describe the way their voices seem swallowed, how words fall flat instead of carrying through the air. They describe sudden headaches, pressure in the skull, the sense of being surrounded though no one stands near. Some claim to hear faint knocks, irregular but deliberate, as though something is answering without language. A few, braver than the rest, admit they left not out of fear but because they felt a kind of invitation, not spoken, not seen, but understood, an urge to stay, to let the silence close around them. None who confessed this ever returned a second time. And still the question lingers, the one no report can answer, the one no story can soften. Where did they go? Did the family walk willingly into the night, their footsteps erased by something unseen? Were they pulled into a place beyond perception, their lives extinguished not by force but by absence itself? Or are they still there, trapped between moments, their presence felt only in the faint impressions left behind? Beds that seemed slept in, a kettle cooling on a stove, a blanket crumpled on the floor. The silence of the house remains. It is not confined to the clearing. It spreads in memory and stories told late at night, in the hush that falls when someone dares to mention the vanished. It lives in the way people pause before opening their own doors after dark, in the way they listen to their houses settling, in the way they wonder if the creak of wood is just wood, or something listening back. And perhaps the most chilling thought of all is not that the family vanished, but that they were never meant to be found. Perhaps disappearance is not accident, not punishment, but part of something larger. A design older than the house, older than the land, older than the people who tell the story. A design that waits quietly, patiently for the next family, the next moment, the next silence to claim. So when the night grows still and you find yourself straining to hear, when your house settles and the air feels too heavy, when your own name seems to echo faintly in your ears though no one has spoken it, ask yourself this: is it only the quiet you're hearing, or has the silence already chosen you? If this story unsettled you, if it pressed against you in ways you cannot shake, then do not let the silence have the last word. Like this video to keep the story alive, comment below with your thoughts about what you believe happened, and subscribe to this channel for more stories that will haunt you long after the screen goes dark.